The United States is a pop cultural superpower. One can debate if this is for good or for worse, but what is almost indisputable is the amount of resources government institutions, ranging from universities to the military and intelligence services, place on steering the direction of cultural icons such as musicians and movie stars. Today, Jay Dyer, known for his incisive analysis on propaganda embedded in American films and music, joins us for a discussion on the so-called countercultural revolution in the 1960s music scene centered around Laurel Canyon, Los Angeles. What appears to be an organic, anti-establishment movement led by artists such as Jim Morrison of The Doors is, upon closer examination, co-opted and steered by the very organizations that they publicly condemn. In America, controlled opposition would appear to take many forms.
Hello, welcome to the show. I'm Nick, and I'm joined by everybody. We got Adam.
Hey, everybody.
Hans.
Hello.
Hank.
Hey, everyone.
Alex.
Howdy.
And a special guest, by popular request and somebody whom I've been a fan of for many years, Jay Dyer. How are you, Jay?
What's up? Doing great. Glad to be here.
Jay, I think a lot of our audience is familiar with your work, but why don't you pretend that they're not and just tell them a little bit about yourself, where they can find your work, your recent book and your recent show, etc.
Yeah, most of my stuff is at jaysanalysis.com or the YouTube channel, Jay Dyer, which has grown quite a bit in the last year. So I put a lot of time in promoting that now. So there's probably 600 or 700 audio, video episodes and 600 or 700 or 800 articles. So a lot of material there. And then, of course, I have the TV show Hollywood Decoded at Gaia TV. And the book is Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which is pretty self-explanatory by the title. And I think that's everything. The second book will be out in the next couple months.
What is the next book called?
Esoteric Hollywood, the sequel.
Very creative, Jay.
I mean, well, yeah, I mean, it's cheesy as heck, but I was like, well, it actually is perfect. I mean,
yeah, I'll look forward to that.
I mean, what else would you call it? It's a book about movies, so you call it the sequel. And then hopefully there'll be a trilogy if number 2 sells good enough.
Have you faced any pushback or any threats by publishing these books? Has Harvey Weinstein tried to grope you or anything?
That's funny you said that, because that's what the guy asked me on Coast to Coast last night. Have you received any threats? Have you been targeted? I was like, I don't think so. I hope not. Not to my knowledge.
Expect you to receive some, because you don't really deal too much with politics from an ideological perspective, but you do come, generally speaking, from the right of things, do you not? Sure, and the book isn't, but it's not like a scandal book. It's not a journalistic book. It's more like film essays and analysis of symbolism and tying it in with geopolitics and history and espionage and all those literature, all these topics come into play in the book. So it's not really, it's not like, let me show you all of the dirt on the Clinton Foundation. You know what I mean? So it's not really a book that would necessarily get a person targeted, I don't think.
If I can give you an endorsement in contrast with somebody like Alex Jones, I think you're very level-headed. You're not sensationalist, and I think you look at things very rationally with an even keel. And I think your contribution is sort of deep analysis where you kind of tie a lot of very obscure threads together into a pattern. So I think if someone is looking for someone who's not as strident as a lot of conspiracy theorists, which I'm not calling you, but I would say basically you're trying to make sense of things and also look behind the scenes a little bit. And in terms of your film work, I think you're one of the better analysts out there, going beyond basic cinematic critique. Yes. I think you're going into more of the cultural aspects.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, when I was taking some film classes in undergrad and grad school, I got the idea to maybe tie all these things together because I read a lot of Ebert's reviews, and Ebert actually does have kind of a literary English degree version. analysis of the films that he does, and at times, and so he can at times delve into the symbolism. Not often. I think on the whole, Ebert's reviews are kind of boring, but what I thought was, why not take it a little bit deeper and get a little bit crazier with it, a little more interesting when it comes to film analysis. And nobody really had done that kind of a book. There was a couple predecessors, like maybe Michael Hoffman's analysis of conspiracy theory that he did back in the 90s. It was kind of in the same vein, but there hadn't really been a book like that. And it's because I was at college and grad school focusing on that very topic, the usage of symbology and by propagandists, basically by intelligence agencies, that the book came to be, because that's what I was studying. So in other words, the reason it's different from an Alex Jones vantage point is that I never claimed to be a journalist. And of course, Alex does claim to be a journalist and documentary filmmaker. And that's not what I claim to be. I'm not a journalist. I don't write news articles. I've written maybe a few like that, but most of the time I'm writing more essay, academic style.
Well, I think for people who are not familiar with the subject, it may surprise them that film and covert operations and the propaganda of the so-called intelligence services they go hand in hand, because generally speaking, what your average person knows about organizations like the CIA or MI6 comes from film media, from
Hollywood. Yeah, exactly.
And then it had also a feedback loop effect that was talked about by what's his name, Victor Marchetti, in CIA and Cult of Intelligence. The way in which films, because I believe you got your start into that field looking at the work of Ian Fleming. Is that right?
Kinda. I mean, I always liked film. So back even in high school, I was a big movie buff, and I always wanted to, get a job working at the movie store so I could just rent movies for free. And that was back in the VHS day. And, I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to go into film. So that was just what I was into. That's what I grew up with, movies. And so when I went to college and I was studying philosophy and comparative religion and all that, it just more and more became clear to me that all these things are connected. They're not disparate fields that have no relation to the other, because even though for a while in my 20s I was a big Alex Jones fan, I would say Alex Jones is kind of an introduction into real deep politics and geopolitics. So I will at least give him credit for kind of introducing me to these topics and becoming interested in, foreign policy, or what's going on in Syria. Why are we going after Libya? What's the thing with weapons of mass destruction? 9/11, blah, blah, blah. And so conspiracy kind of functions as a gateway to espionage and geopolitics. And when you study that at a graduate level, you realize that, well, espionage is very real. Every government in the history of the world has practiced espionage. They've practiced counterintelligence against spies from other places. And then, of course, corporations nowadays also engage in corporate espionage and corporate counterintelligence. So all that stuff's very real. And then you realize that, well, where did I get my sense of how the world works? As you said, everybody most of the time gets it from fiction stories from Hollywood. And then me, being somebody who's just interested in what's true, I kind of dug in deep trying to figure out, well, what's the real story here? How actually connected are, studio heads, producers, the CIA, Mossad, et cetera, et cetera. And you come to find out that all these things are intimately connected. There's really hardly any distinction between these things at times. I'm not saying that everybody who's an actor is in the CIA or anything ridiculous like that, but I will say that I think Ben Affleck was pretty much telling the truth when he said in the Guardian interview a couple of years ago that the CIA, that Hollywood is full of the CIA. They're basically flip sides of the same coin. And then when you start to study it at an academic level, it all makes perfect sense. And you're like, well, why didn't I see that before? 10 years ago, I would have thought this sounds crazy to think that there would be this close relationship. Now it's just like, well, yeah, that's obvious, but that's because I put, 10 years into looking at that topic. But yes, a little bit later down the road, the Fleming stuff did come to the fore as one of the preeminent examples of somebody who had a direct connection to Pulp Fiction, to Hollywood, to the big studios, and to propaganda and psyops. And I can't think of a better example than Ian Fleming. I mean, I've never seen. I mean, some of these guys, like Tom Clancy and these kind of characters, are similar. They have like this military industrial complex, Pentagon type background, and Steve Pachenik writing with Tom Clancy and all that as a Black Ops guy. But it's just the Fleming stuff is more interesting.
Well, what's interesting about Fleming, real quick, Alex, is that his sort of storytelling about what the spy world is like really has no resemblance to reality. And I think if you look at him as sort of even an asset of the CIA or MI6, you could see why they would want the public to perceive this world that way, because then they just don't know what to look for when they actually are encountering someone from the CIA. And it gets to a question I had for you, which is, how do you actually, if there's any quick, litmus test you can offer anyone, how do you identify a CIA asset in a place like Hollywood as opposed to somebody who's just an actor?
Well, first thing I would say is that there is and there isn't an aspect of truth to the Bond character or the Fleming stories. So they're not completely false and they're not completely true. There are and have been pretty famous, they're called Romeos. That's spies who were able to use their good looks to basically seduce targets or marks for a specific, espionage reason or blackmail reason. So that's very real. That's happened before. There's famous cases of Romeos. And then, of course, with females, there's swallows. That's very famous as well. There's no doubt that that's gone on. Espionage is the second oldest profession in the history of the world. So after prostitution.
Yeah.
So there are people who have done some pretty exciting and amazing things. But yes, there's also a lot of propaganda and a lot of exaggeration in Fleming's stories. But for example, the 00 kill status, that as far as I can tell is very real. In fact, Gordon Carrera, who's a mainline intelligence MI5 history writer, talks about in his book Art of Betrayal, he talks about the reality of the 00 status, that there are individuals that do have that. That was rumored for a long time. Annie Michon, who's a former MI5 that I interviewed about 5 or 6 years ago, she's talked about the 00 status as well. So, it's just, it is and it isn't, So the way that it isn't is like most of the stuff that Fleming is projecting onto Soviets or SMERSH or Spectre is the kind of stuff British intelligence would do. So it's kind of it's a projection where, we're going to say that, Blofeld wants to, kill everybody off or steal from the Federal Reserve or, rip everybody off. That's pretty much what the establishment's doing, right? It's not, it's not Blofeld doing the false flag, some shady terrorist organization. It's actually many times the intelligence services themselves. So it is and it isn't real.
Well, I think this is a good transition into the actual topic of today's episode, which I think is right in Jay's wheelhouse, and it's the intersection of espionage and culture in the context of the countercultural revolution that took place in the 1960s. And we touched on this briefly in our episode on the Hells Angels, but we'd like to expand further on it. And why don't we just start with the mainline understanding of the counterculture and the 60s flower power revolution? How is it that you think that the average person thinks about the scene in the 60s and its impact on American culture?
I think the normie tale is that there was just an organic uprising and wellspring of malcontents and discontents who felt like it was just time to stop going along with, having 2 kids and a garage and 2-story house and car, whatever. They were tired of the corporate company man image, and they were tired of wars, and that it became evident that these wars were being fought for, what, oil companies or for the CIA or something. So whatever the typical left narrative is. And this just kind of broke out. It just broke out. These revolutions just happen. They just break out. They're not planned. It's just creative, weird people like Ken Kesey and Tim Leary. They just start these revolutions. And, musicians, creative people get involved, and it just happens. And this led to a big alteration in the culture. And the boomers see themselves as kind of the inheritors of this counterculture, this revolution, which they feel like, saved things and set the world on a right path or whatever. But I really tend to think that none of that's true. It's not really the case that revolutions happen without backing, without people studying these revolutions, without people knowing and projecting what's to come. And you don't really get that view until you start looking at big-scale geopolitical works, big tomes, think tanks, white papers. Once you understand that level of the control structure, then you start to understand how not only is it possible, it's the norm. It's almost always the case that revolutions are foreseen, they're studied, they're planned, they're fostered, big money is put into them. And it's been that way, at least in the West. If we look at Quigley, going back to the French Revolution, Quigley talks about Protestant Swiss and Jewish bankers backing the French Revolution, and so essentially every revolutionary movement from then, and probably prior to that as well, all the way up to the 60s is no different. They're all successive, quote, revolutions. They really had powerful financial backing for various reasons, but the 60s Cultural Revolution is the most relevant because it's so significantly changed the landscape and mindset of America as a whole.
And none of this should be too surprising if people are familiar with the work of previous guest of ours, E. Michael Jones, namely the ways in which sexual liberation and narcotics are used as mechanisms of social control. And one thing that I found very interesting, I would highly recommend to our listeners, at least, especially if any of our listeners are fans of the music from that era, particularly the early stuff such as the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield, the Doors, Love, the Mamas and the Papas, to check out the work of Dave McGowan, Weird Scenes from Inside the Canyon. And McGowan, who unfortunately passed away a few years back, I think it was, maybe 2 years. I don't know exactly.
2015, I believe.
Yeah, 15. He draws out some very interesting facts about the early scene that was coming to shape what would later be more associated probably with the Haight-Ashbury scene in San Francisco. Right. But it had its genesis. These bands all had their genesis in a little area outside of LA known as Laurel Canyon. And Laurel Canyon is a fascinating place. In fact, Jay, do you have anything you want to say about the prior history of Laurel Canyon before the 1960s?
Well, there are older precedents that Dave does mention. For example, Houdini. Mm-hmm. Houdini was a Laurel Canyon resident. Apparently, he was also a Mason and to some degree worked as an intelligence asset. I want to say, if I recall, was it Scotland Yard? I think that is who McGowan says.
Confirmed it, yes. It was.
Yeah. And, there was also reportedly strange deaths, I think, that occurred in the vicinity of wherever Houdini lived in the canyon. So there has been this weird history, kind of almost a kind of spooky tales, paranormal type thing, like ghost hunters type stuff. Which I'm not saying that necessarily is true or false, but there is something to the vicinity, to the locale. As I was telling you guys before we started, I went a couple of years ago, 2 summers ago at this very time. I was in California. We were checking out Lookout Mountain Studios and Wonderland Avenue and Mulholland Drive and Rand Corporation and all that stuff. And you do get a weird vibe. I mean, yeah, it's probably because I had just been reading all this stuff and I had that in my mind. But, you also have the Vacaville prison facility in the same vicinity, if I recall. And that was, at least there's some indication that this was connected to mind control experimentation. But I think he does. I think Dave does mention some other.
Well, he talks about, and
this is definitely in your wheelhouse, Jay, the Lookout Mountain Laboratory.
Well, yeah, no, I was going to mention that with the Air Force basically having its own private secret studio, and of course you have Walt Disney, Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, and Marilyn Monroe all having basically DoD clearance access to come to Laurel Canyon Studios. And actually, somebody dug up, I think last year, I put it in some of the talks I've done for subscribers, archived public footage now, reels of Jimmy Stewart's recordings from Laurel Canyon. They're still on YouTube. You can find them if you track them down. Just look up the Laurel Canyon archive footage. I think it's just what it's titled. But you'll see a lot of the war reels that they were producing there, a lot of the latest in like 3D or visual technology, film technology, imaging, and so forth. Cinematography was really cutting edge at Laurel Canyon, and it's also where they filmed the Trinity bomb imagery. It was put together, produced at Laurel Canyon Studios. So it's a very important thing. It's not something irrelevant to American culture. We don't even know all the stuff that was filmed there and what its purposes were. So there's a lot of that surrounding it.
The Trinity bomb footage you can see was put into the, I think it was 1995 film Trinity and Beyond.
Yeah.
There was allegedly over 19,000 films made in this government facility, and this was beginning in the 1940s.
Right.
So what ended up happening with respect to the music scene and the music, people looking at this in the current year may think that the mass migration of various aspiring musicians across the country to this little canyon outside of Los Angeles was because it was a big place to be. But the thing that's interesting is that it was not actually at the time. Right. This was created from scratch because the centers of music in America were places like Memphis and New York.
It was. You have this alluded to in L.A. Confidential at the beginning. Danny DeVito reads out this kind of promo for why you should come to L.A. and it's supposed to be a selling point to get people to move there as a new kind of Valhalla, basically, is the way they pitch it. And it worked, apparently, because a lot of people did move there. I am of the opinion, and actually there's a great talk that John Adams from Hoaxbusters does, because he's kind of his own private California historian. He's really into that. He's researched this pretty in depth. He's done some interviews that are 2-3 hours that are really good on all of this stuff in relation to the history of California. And being, as my dad was in the Navy, I'm kind of the opinion, and was stationed in San Diego, that you kind of have in California a military industrial complex state. The whole state is pretty much run by the Navy and the deep state, so to speak. And
Silicon Valley is deeply enmeshed with the MIC. I mean, the entire microprocessor industry was developed for military
Vietnam
aircraft.
War. I mean, all those fighter jets and guided missiles were set up.
Pre-Vietnam. They were making vacuum tubes for World War II.
Yeah, I mean, Silicon Valley was planned to be Silicon Valley. I mean, and there's all kinds of actually hidden naval bases, in California. There's all kinds of stuff like that. So I think that the thesis is correct, that California is kind of a lab experiment, a test bed for things to come in the rest of the country 20 or 30 years later. It kind of starts there, and then it, like a virus, it sort of spills out to Middle America. Same with New York, more or less. But yeah, so it's not hard when you understand that kind of stuff, that level, that perspective. It's not hard to believe, especially with the Air Force studio being there, that even then it was intimately connected to Hollywood. The highest people in Hollywood were coming to Laurel Canyon. And so it's not hard to believe that they could set up a test bed for a burgeoning revolutionary music scene.
And so the music scene that came to exist was one of the main people behind it. One of the sort of the ringleaders of the Laurel Canyon scene was, of course, Frank Zappa. And Zappa has an interesting family background. Zappa's father was he worked at a chemical weapons facility in, I believe, Maryland.
Yeah, and it's like a bioweapon facility.
Yeah, it was a bioweapons facility. And Zappa, as an interesting character, I mean, he was basically a teetotaler. He didn't really consume any kind of drugs, and I don't believe he drank at all. Certainly drank a lot of black coffee, but he had a lot of contempt for what he called the freaks, who would be called elsewhere the hippies. Yet he was creating this scene. He had a house in Laurel Canyon that was known as the Log Cabin, where these people would come and go. And not only that, you take Jim Morrison, whose father was a Navy admiral, and not only was he a Navy admiral, but he was a Navy admiral who was present for the Gulf of Tonkin fake provocation. And Zappa ended up marrying a kindergarten. Was she a kindergarten classmate? It was Gail Sloatman. She was a fellow Navy brat. She became, Gail Zappa. So these people were intertwined in a very interesting level, and they all ended up here in Laurel Canyon.
Yeah, if I can add to that, if anybody thinks two data points is just a coincidence, you'd be right, but it's actually more than two, according to Dave McGowan's book. The Doors, the Monkees, the Beach Boys, Mamas and Papas, including Frank Zappa and Jim Morrison, the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, all these bands actually, their parents of the band leaders apparently were involved in military intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Well, in the case of the Mamas and the Papas, not only were they involved in military intelligence, a lot of these people came from, yes, military connected backgrounds, but also old American stock, old WASP money power. And for instance, John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, he was a child, yes, of the military intelligence scene. And he married a Susie Adams. Initially, he actually ended up marrying a 14-year-old girl later. But his initial wife, by which he had two children, was a Susie Adams, who was a direct descendant of John Adams. And you had also Graham Parsons, who's actually one of my favorite musicians. He came from a line on his mother's side known as the Snively family, and this was a wealthy Florida citrus grove family. Also, his father, Cecil Ingram Connor II, was a military officer and bomber pilot. And the list goes on. I mean, America, the band that did the song Horse with No Name, all three of the leading vocalists in the band were from military families. And
I want to say too that there's all kinds of crazy connections, like even Laura Dern, who features prominently in many David Lynch films. I think it was her granddad. Bruce Dern's dad or uncle was a Department of Defense and was Skull and Bones.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of this to me, there was a point that EMJ made in our episode with him where I asked him if the Wasps would ever return. He said no, because they took their propaganda too seriously. And this seems like a case of many of these WASP families actually becoming enamored with their own social engineering. Like the heir to the Adams family, founders of this country, actually becoming like music scene brats and getting involved in the hippie movement. It's a really curious endeavor that they seem to have embarked on and then become part of the story themselves.
Yeah, and then the generations later continue the revolution into the social justice warrior stuff, which all this tranny social justice warrior stuff is really just the next phase of the very thing that these people were into.
Well, and it's not just their families either. Dave McGowan cast aspersions on many of the people themselves, like John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas. He was in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I was going to say, didn't one of them actually do intelligence work in like Vietnam? Was that Crosby or was that?
That was Stephen Stills
that's right.
Yeah. Well, it was Stephen Stills, but Crosby has his own interesting pedigree. I mean, Crosby's family also was. I mean, he came from, again, another confluence of military and old money power. His full name was David Van Cordelant Crosby.
Yeah.
And so these people all, I mean, Masons, military intelligence, old WASP money.
A lot of skull and bones. Yeah.
The skull and bones. They all showed up here. And this scene was created out of whole cloth because I guess we should talk a little bit, Jay, about somebody who gets neglected in the histories of this era that are written for the boomers and the nostalgic tones. I mean, David Crosby himself, who apparently wrote multiple autobiographies, funny enough, failed to mention a very interesting man by the name of Vito Paleckis.
Yes, Vito and the Freaks, who's supposedly, according to Dave, the first real hippie propagandist. And have you watched the videos on YouTube with Vito?
Yes, the dancing.
Yeah, and the interview with him where he says that he hates LSD, so he was almost a kind of teetotaler, just like Zappa. Isn't that interesting? He's like,
they both ran these. They both married women far younger than themselves. They both were surrounded by basically a harem of underage girls, and they both had interesting backgrounds. I mean, his sister, I believe, she married into the Rockefeller line. Eva Polakis, she married Winthrop Rockefeller.
Oh, okay.
And she went by several different names. He also had a military background. He was imprisoned for armed robbery back in the 30s, and he had a 25-year sentence, but ended up being released into the Merchant Marines during the wartime, where he was involved in escorting Lend-Lease transport vessels. And so he shows up. He's neglected because, for whatever reason, people don't like to talk like these cherished bands. They were, supposed to be fantastic from the beginning, but the reality was all these bands were terrible in the beginning. And you had Phil Spector, who was recently, of course, convicted of murder.
Right.
He had a group of musicians, of studio musicians, known as the Wrecking Crew, and they would play backup for these bands. So the very first of these albums released was the Byrds. It was their Mr. Tambourine Man, and that was predominantly covers of Bob Dylan and like Pete Seeger. And
that would answer one of my questions, I think. We're talking about the Bonesman diaspora here. It's a pretty small group of people. So I was wondering how it was that you have this small pool. How are you going to get musical talent out of it reliably? And I think quite good musical talent, at least in some cases. The Doors were, if nothing else, pretty good, pretty creative.
Well, it's funny you say that, Alex, because the Doors, McGowan doesn't come out and say it explicitly, and I'm curious what your take is on this, Jay. But the Doors were notorious for being very poor live band,
right?
And allegedly the songs were all written by Jim Morrison prior to the formation of the band, and not just the songs, not just the lyrics, but the songs themselves.
And Jim Morrison did not know how to play a single instrument. He had no musical training whatsoever. What he did write was poetry, but that, again, it was not just the lyrics. It was the songs themselves that were allegedly recorded.
And apparently that was later in his life after he was a musician, I heard.
The poetry? Yeah. I mean, he wrote it throughout his life. But yes, they were allegedly, all the songs were allegedly written in a 3-year period. I think the story goes that he was dropping acid in Venice.
Right.
In Venice Beach, and he wrote in the 3-year period all of the Doors songs, and none of the other guys knew how to play either. And so there's this lingering possibility. Same with John Phillips, the Mamas and Papas. They actually wrote this electric folk stuff while they were staying in the Caribbean and partying in the Caribbean. So they were they were not in the Laurel Canyon LA scene at the time that the stuff was written. And they happened to come up with the exact same style of music that would then be pushed by the Byrds, this electric folk. So there's a lot of suggestions that these people, there was something, I mean, we know, for instance, as I mentioned, that Phil Spector's studio group, the Wrecking Crew, were doing a lot of the recordings. The bands that we do know were legit from the beginning in terms of musical aptitude was Arthur Lee's Love, a band which I'm actually a big fan of. And the Byrds did have what's his name, Chris Hillman, who is actually a very accomplished musician, but he was accomplished as, I believe, a mandolin player. And they had him put in as a bassist, and he initially did not know how to play the bass. He did learn to play the bass and learned to play it quite well. But primarily the Byrds just had Chris Hillman, Roger McGinn, and later when Graham Parsons joined for their best, in my opinion, album, Sweetheart of the Rodeo. But what's your take on this, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, I remember all that, and I think that Dave more or less kind of gives the impression that the same way that we might think about the pop stars today, like a Taylor Swift, actually there's millions of dollars that goes into making Taylor Swift before she becomes Taylor Swift. And so it's not the story of, whoever's got the talent, the cream rises to the top. No, it actually, a lot of money goes into picking and making these bands. And I think Dave's kind of saying that that's more or less the same thing that was going on then. Maybe not so much millions of dollars, but the idea that it wasn't just because these people were just amazingly creative and just so talented and original that they started this movement and the scene. They actually probably had a lot of backing to help start this scene.
And let's get into some of the mechanics of this. Like, a record company at the time, now record companies are almost superfluous. What do they really do? But back in the day, they were major capital-intensive, human capital-intensive endeavors. So they would have an entire pipeline that essentially discovered or decided that, even going back to the 40s and 50s, this R&B stuff, it's really catching on. So we need some more R&B bands. And one of the ways that you can do that is you have talent scouts essentially go out and find existing R&B bands. The other way that you can do it is you find some guys who can just play like your solid studio musicians. Uh-huh. And you essentially form a brand. Like you find a front man who maybe they can sing, maybe they're personable or they have charisma, but you're sort of just using them as an avenue to kind of just make music. Like it's not coming from their kind of unique genius. You're just cranking out R&B songs. You have a writer, you have studio musicians. And
this was enabled in a major way by new developments in technology, because this is what Phil Spector did with those various girl groups like, the Ronettes and the Crystals, and this is famous wall of sound technique. This stuff was heavily using technology in a studio, and a lot of use of overdubs, for instance, to create those, pristine harmonies that you'll hear with, say, the Byrds.
Yeah, it was very expensive to do. I mean, if anybody's seen Boogie Nights, which is obviously about the pornography industry in the 70s and 80s, one of the funnier moments of the movie is when I guess it was Dirk Diggler, I forget his actual name, but that was the character's name on screen, trying to make a record. And they couldn't scrape together the cash to buy the tapes, and so they're on this like 15-20 minute like journey to like try to get the tapes from the record company. They wouldn't give it to them because they couldn't pay for it. So it was a lot of money to produce this stuff. You had to get studio recording time, you had to get the actual physical hardware and put it on physical tapes, unlike today where somebody in a bedroom could come up with electronic music.
Well, and it was not just the albums that were made in this way, but these clubs that started popping up on the Sunset Strip popped up out of nowhere. They popped up in anticipation of a scene that was going to be developing. Old clubs that were, previously owned by syndicate type forces, the old Bugsy Siegel clubs from the 40s were, reopened and renovated, all in anticipation of this. And we mentioned Vito Palekis earlier. Well, what would happen is when they would play these shows, he would bring in this troupe of 30 of these freaks, these proto hippies, and they would create a scene. They would be very into the music, and it would create this atmosphere like, oh, well, something's happening.
And they would be nude.
Yeah,
they would be topless.
They would all be they would all be babes. They would all be young chicks, and he ran a cult.
Yes. It was, and I thought the chapter where Dave made all the parallels to Manson, that was very telling, because it almost gives the impression that Manson is a similar kind of concoction.
Well, Manson, ironically, was actually a better musician than a lot of the early Byrds. He impressed himself heavily on Dennis Wilson, and there's a lot of this small community. There was a lot of this overlap between these people, like Manson.
Brian Wilson.
It was Dennis.
Beach Boys. Brian Wilson, right?
Well, and his brother, Dennis.
I was trying to remember which. Dave talks about one of them and I've seen an interview. I think it's Brian. I'm sorry, but he talks about having multiple personalities.
Oh, Brian. Yeah. Well, Brian went insane. Yeah, Brian was the one who went insane, but Dennis was the one who recorded with Manson, and all that stuff was allegedly lost. Furthermore, Bobby Busalil, who went on to murder what is his name? Hinman, Gary Hinman. He tortured and murdered Hinman, and Bobby Busalil was he played guitar on the band that would go on to be Love, Grassroots, and he also, he starred in Kenneth Anger, and Kenneth Anger, by the way, also has military intelligence connections.
Exactly. That's
He's an occultist. He starred in Kenneth Anger's Lucifer Rising. And one thing that I did not know until I had read Dave McGowan's book was that Vito Palekis had a 3-year-old child who died under very mysterious circumstances.
Falling off a roof,
Yeah, falling through like a glass ceiling or a... Yeah, and the whole story is very strange. There's a lot of suggestions that, because we'll get in, I think, a bit later into all the mysterious deaths and how you account for them. And the houses that burn down seems to be a quite common thing. Yes, LA has fires, but there's these seem to be a bit more specific, and a lot of them seem to pop up wherever David Crosby went. But anyways, the son of Vito Palekis was originally going to be the child was originally going to be in Lucifer Rising as the subject that was played eventually by Bobby Busalil. And Bobby Busalil, for those that don't know, was, for all intents and purposes, a member of the family, the Notorious family.
And was in a band called Magical Powerhouse of Oz, correct?
Yes. And furthermore, in terms of these weird connections, like Sharon Tate, who was, of course, murdered in the Tate LaBianca killing, she was actually supposed to play the role that I think you'll know about this, Jay, that what's her name ended up playing in Rosemary's Baby. Was it Mia Farrow?
Mia Farrow, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think she's in Lucifer Rising as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
and doesn't she play some kind of satanic witch or sacrificial role?
If I remember right, that was the case. Yeah.
So. Yeah, and Polanski ties into this, and then some people think that the reason Polanski did Rosemary's Baby with the guy being an actor who's trying to make it, and his young wife, being
Vincent Cassel.
Cassavetes, right? Roman Cassavetes. Right. Well, in other words, that might be Roman Polanski.
Right.
Even though Roman wasn't really an actor, he did act. He's in Chinatown, for example, in a brief role. But it's
Cassavetes went on to be a director in his own right. Is actually quite a good director. At least his film "Killing of a Chinese Bookie" is a very good movie. But
well, there's obviously something going on, something real to all this, because the story was also that there was witchcraft involved in terms of Angelica Houston, and that's, if I recall, it was at her house that the rape incident occurred with Roman Polanski and the girl.
Yes.
Yeah. And then you also have the strange death of Christian Brando, his house being basically raised over. I think Jack Nicholson bought Marlon Brando's house after Christian Brando died and had it basically bulldozed.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it was after Marlon died that I think he finally bought it.
Okay.
And it was.
But there are questions about Christian Brando's death, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Jay, what do you make? Really quickly, Nick. What do you mentioned witchcraft? What do you make of a lot of the long-standing allegations of the WASP ruling class and other members of the ruling class in America being involved in witchcraft, being involved in the occult? I think recently there was a photo posted of Anderson Cooper as a child, and above his bed in his bedroom was some kind of effigy of Jesus being burned to a moon god or some really crazy stuff.
I don't think that kind of altar set is anything significant. Gloria Vanderbilt was a professing Catholic, so I could see that just very easily being a kind of if you go to Portugal or if you go to these kinds of Catholic countries, you'll find this kind of cheap Catholic trinket type stuff. It's called in Portugal they call it tadagish, and then it's not really intended to be occultic. I've seen what you're talking about. Every time somebody asks me about it, actually I just think that's supposed to be either a relic, a body in a reliquary, which if you go to a lot of Catholic churches or Orthodox churches, you will see
that
bodies.
Is common, yeah.
And I just think it's two angels.
Probably a representation of Saint Lawrence, who is the one who's burned alive.
Gotcha. But what do you think of some of these other long-standing allegations about?
I think it's absolutely true.
General witchcraft practice.
It's absolutely true. In fact, do you remember the movie Dark Shadows?
Yes.
You mean the show or the remake movie?
The remake movie. I mean, and the show, yes. But that's actually about one of the elite New England families who was into weird esoteric witchcraft stuff. And I remember when I first heard that, I thought that's crazy. That's not true. Well, I actually looked into the history of the family. You've got a long pedigree of high-level Freemasonry. If I recall, is it the Astors? I forget who it is. Maybe not the Astors. It's one of the famous WASP bloodline families that's behind the Dark Shadow story. I meant to do an analysis. I think I forgot to do it, but that's actually true. And there was a graduate paper that somebody did a long time ago, and I wish I had saved it, but I didn't. And they had actually dug up the witchcraft that was done by some of the first Puritan New England families. If you dig enough, you can find that stuff. It can be substantiated. I think that it's true. Some of the Puritan families were actually doing witchcraft. They were into Hermeticism. And you can actually see this when you look at the progress of Harvard. Harvard was founded by these people. This is why they became Unitarian Universalists. A lot of these families did.
And several of these musicians that we're talking about went to Harvard, like Graham Parsons.
Yes.
Most of these people came from the D.C. area, including the suburbs in Virginia. Also, I would recommend to people interested in the witchcraft stuff to read Margaret Murray's book, The Witch Cult in Western Europe.
Yeah. Also, if you're wanting to find more of this connection, look up the history of the Unitarian Universalists, and the Calvinist Puritan families, and you'll find a lot of connections.
I have a second question for both Nick and Jay. We're talking a lot about the CIA participating in the creation of this counterculture. How would you make of the CIA then cracking down on these people with Operation Chaos, Project Merrimack? What was the other one? I think Project Resistance, through Helms and Angleton. These guys essentially targeting the anti-war hippie community after they participated in creating them. What do you make of that?
There's an element of damage control going on for the broader scene of just the lemmings who got swept up in it. But it's interesting to note that the ringleaders of this new scene were frequently when they were, nabbed by the fuzz for whatever kind of either drug charges or, people around them committing suicide in weird ways. They were let go. These people, there's clearly an element of these people who were being protected. And
yes, and promoted. For example, the chapter where Dave talks about the Turkish guy Mehmet, whatever, that ran EMI music. If all these bands were truly countercultural and destructive to American living and capitalism and all this stuff, then why did Time Magazine, why did EMI Records give these people, all these record deals? Because, why were they featured on? Who was the big music TV show at the time?
Oh, jeez.
One of those shows that features the bands. I forget what it's called, but Dave talks
Ed Sullivan or something.
Yeah,
it was Ed Sullivan. Yeah,
Dave talks about that, like that. If they really were anti-establishment, they would not have been promoted to the hilt by big establishment outlets. So, but a good example of what you're talking about with why would they crack down on things that they were involved in would be the student riots. In the 60s, you had Kent State and you had Chicago Democratic Convention riots, and most people thought, well, this was just anti-war protesters, and then the establishment, COINTELPRO, whatever, came down on them. Actually, if you read Ingdahl's book, and if you read Pentagon's Brain that I just finished, the sections where they talk about this was actually a Rand Corporation experiment on mob behavior. So yes, there were people really, protesting and really getting the smack put down on them, but the mob and the protest, the swarming, was being studied by the Rand Corporation, who wanted this to happen the entire time. So basically, you can have like the COINTEL, FBI people cracking down on a group that they think is bad, and they never even have a clue that the group got its ideological push and funding from radical professors who were parts of foundations
and CIA assets like Timothy O'Leary.
Well, you mentioned Time Magazine, and that was a direct CIA asset.
Yeah, Henry Luce, Skull and Bones.
Time Magazine itself under Luce they were the ones to initially promote the phenomenon of the magic mushroom. They sent that guy, what was his name? Gordon Wasson. Yeah, they sent him down to South America, and they ran
who was a banker working for J.P. Morgan.
Yes. They basically ran an ad, like a multi-page ad in the form of, I guess you'd call it an article, for the magic mushroom.
Yeah, another weird connection was I think Zorthian. I don't remember his first name, but remember he was VP of Time, and then he was, I think, the leader of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon during the entirety of the Vietnam War, and he ended up kind of becoming an ally of the Bush family in the later years.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Jay.
Another thing too is that people who say might be a CIA handler or an operative or something like that, there are people way above that. So the people that work at, say, the Rockefeller Foundation or the Ford Foundation or the CFR or Trilateral Commission or Brzezinski, a Kissinger, they're far above that level of field operative. So while a field operative might be partaking in something like Operation, Smush Butt or whatever, the guys high above them might have another motive beyond, just getting the bad guys or whatever.
And you have taking place in this time too. You have the Esalen Institute, which was likely studying this exact phenomenon of how you control masses of people with how you create a certain scene with music and with LSD.
This is a great point. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Esalen. And the more that I dig into Esalen over the years, the crazier and crazier it becomes, because, you can't really have this kind of burgeoning counterculture revolution without some place giving birth to the ideology behind it. And I think really the best candidate for that is Esalen. And this is really just a whole bunch of so-called forward-thinking progressives, right? But many of them also just magically end up having CIA connections, working for the CIA. Big-time New Agers. You've got Deepak Chopra, you've got the Huxleys. You just look at the members of the Esalen Institute, and it's basically all of the big names of the last 60 years.
Speaking of Huxley, he lived in Laurel Canyon briefly towards the end of his life as well, before he died on the day of JFK's assassination. And Bobby Bussolil allegedly sold a vacuum to him, if I remember right.
I forgot about that, but yeah.
Trippy. Well, you mentioned New Age. I think that whole terminology was literally invented or popularized mainly by Anton LaVey and the part of the intelligence network associated with the Church of Satan.
Well, and Timothy O'Leary's cohort, what's his name? Ram Dass as well.
Yeah. Timothy O'Leary was working at, I think, Princeton, right?
Was he
at Princeton or Harvard?
It was Harvard. He was fired. Okay. Him and Ram Dass, I think, were the only two people ever fired from Harvard.
And what was interesting is that a lot of people don't know, you guys probably do, but that there's also a Crowleyan occult pedigree to Tim Leary. In fact, if you read some of his other books, he's got a whole commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is very bizarre.
Aleister Crowley?
And he ties it into Crowleyanism. And, there's interviews with Leary promoting Crowley. And openly.
Crowley himself was an intelligence asset. Jay, I believe you did an interview with the man who wrote the book Agent 666.
Yeah, Dr. Richard Spence. I think he pretty convincingly shows that was what was going on. We know that he did have at least one period of being an MI5 asset and a period of being a provocateur early on.
And he was the one who gave mescaline to Aldous Huxley, if I remember correctly.
Well, that's the story. Yeah,
that's the story.
But there was something I was going to say about, as for the New Age, interestingly, this does actually predate both Crowley and LaVey, as far as
Blavatsky.
I'm aware, with Blavatsky and the Scottish Rite putting out a magazine saying that there will be a new Aeon. Blavatsky said that it would be the public schools that would bring the new Aeon, the New Age.
And if I remember correctly, Vito Pilecki, he had like a double, whose name, he was an Italian. I forget his actual name, but he went by Captain Fuck. And Captain Fuck's father was actually an architect who worked on those buildings, like the Scottish Rite building and other Masonic buildings. Yeah.
Wow, I forgot that.
Yeah, it gives it's one of those things when reading this stuff, you're gonna end up with like a True Detective tier, like thumbtacks and string on the wall. Because these people's relationships are it's so fascinating. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, Zappa's wife was a childhood friend of Morrison.
Well, speaking of the Unitarian Universalists, that's who were the champions of Blavatsky's idea of the public schools bringing in the New Age. And I have an essay that I wrote based on a 400-page history of American education called Messianic Character of American Education. That's really good by Rushdoony. I think it's on my recommended reading list. But I did a kind of a summation article about a year ago that I would recommend called Public School Brainwashing or something like that. If you search at my site, you'll find it. But you'll see all the quotes from the earliest founders of American public education, like Horace Mann, John Dewey, etc., especially Horace Mann and a few of the others, they were committed Unitarian Universalists. And then you start to realize a lot of these women in the Unitarian Universalist movement are pushing this kind of new age education and pedagogy at the beginning of American public schooling. So a long time ago, and then you start to think, well, I can see how they would be witches. Like they're literally probably members of covens. And I think Unitarian Universalism is, in many cases, is a kind of cover for witchcraft and various covens to demonstrate that.
Rushdoony, he was the Reconstructionist guy who was like Gary North married his daughter or something like that.
That's true, yeah. But Rushdoony does have some insightful books because he was an avid historian. Rushdoony had a library of 40,000 books.
Oh wow!
And so there's some kooky stuff in Rushdoony, but he also has some gems here and there, like his book "The One and the Many" is a gem when it comes to analyzing the history of political theory. His book on American education is great for showing how it was New Age from the get-go. So there's some gems from Rushdoony.
And I'm curious to get your speculation, Jay, on what the specific mechanics behind this are, because one thing that is fascinating is the extent to which a lot of these guys, these early guys who were really responsible for creating the scene, did not really engage in the kind of leftist politics that the boomer acolytes would go on to promote.
Yeah. Right.
Zappa, for instance, was widely considered to be very authoritarian. I mean, in his later years, he didn't end up doing work for like the World Bank and the WTO before he
Absolutely,
died?
He did. I couldn't believe that when Dave said it, and I looked it up, and sure enough, it was true.
Yeah, and he went to like Czechoslovakia after the NATO regime was installed.
Yep.
And was given like this promotion by the president, and go ahead, Jay.
No, go ahead.
Well, he proclaimed himself, I remember, to be like a fanatical capitalist or something to that effect.
Yeah, and you have a kind of a reverse situation with Don Henley and the Eagles, who go on to be these sort of rabid, like eco freaks. So they're kind of like the reverse. Well, they're not the reverse, because actually the eco tyrant types that fits very well with the kind of control freak Pentagon types, because they're not at cross purposes. That's all part of the same plan, actually.
It ties into the potentially some sort of nature religion type.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. And John Denver, I think, doesn't John Denver come up in?
I don't remember.
Too? Maybe not.
He might have. I don't remember John Denver.
But that was his job too. John Denver was working. Is it Aspen Institute and the World Wildlife Foundation stuff? That's all started by the, British eugenicists and big money from Prince Philip and Prince Charles.
And
I have a question at some point.
Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Thank you. So I think you guys are making a great case that there's an organization here tied in with the old WASP bloodlines. They're pushing on different fronts. They have different operations going. My question, and I have a feeling I might know what the answer is, but maybe some of our listeners are confused. What is the big picture? What are these people trying to do?
I have my ideas, and I'm sure Jay has his. Why don't you go first, Jay?
Well, one of the things I do in my Globalist book series lecture is try to answer that very question, and that's really just me reading and summarizing and analyzing and lecturing on the most important texts from the top social engineers and planners and so forth, technocrats. So I'm about 15 or 16 books into that in the last couple of years at my site or YouTube channel. And you kind of eventually get a rounded out picture, when you've read Brzezinski and Quigley and Jacques Attali and H.G. Wells and all these top strategists. They all kind of end up basically saying the same thing. And yeah, I'm going to sound a little cliche, but it's really just about depopulation and world government and controlling mankind. That's really the easiest way to summarize it. And they don't really disagree overall on the plans, because, for example, you say, well, how does that relate to the hippie movement? Well, the social engineering alteration of the counterculture, if you study the Tavistock Institute and you study their Stanford research document, Changing Images of Man, you'll see the similarities of what they wanted to do, not just by having this movement sparked, but where would it take things in, say, 20 years? So what would be the effect of the generation after the boomers, right? How would their children be impacted by the basic cult brainwashing that the boomers went through, in their time period? How would the children and successive generations after that be affected by these ideas? So it's basically studied in business phases. And if you read, say, Daniel Estlin's book on Tavistock, you get that picture pretty clearly, especially from documents that are famous, well-known, like Changing Images of Man, where they basically just say what they want to do. And then you find, Brzezinski says the exact same thing. He doesn't differ. David Rockefeller, when he writes his books, he says the same thing. Jacques Attali, the French technocrat, says all the same stuff. So, the revolution basically goes global. And that's what Huxley said would happen in Brave New World. So, and I don't just mean like the revolution of, all of the revolutions are all steered to this purpose. So that's why the countercultural revolution led to basically the globalization of Hollywood. That's why every culture now is beginning to have its own Hollywood, Bollywood, right? You start to see the same K-pop. It's popping up. It's the exact same as the American crap pop. It's meant to go global. Now all the tranny stuff is going global at the behest of the Fortune 100.
Sure.
So that's what it's all about.
I saw a statistic this week that only 2/3 of Gen Z kids identify as exclusively heterosexual. So we can see the fruits of this.
Wow. That's scary.
I hope that's not true.
That survey is a piece of shit. Like you can't believe things like the underlying data is like cultivated so that it can have that result, so that it can go through this complex of being publicized, so that it can become a meme to be self-reinforcing.
Okay,
but there's no underlying there.
Well, and you couldn't have that stuff without two prominent figures propped up by the establishment, Freud and Alfred Kinsey. And Alfred Kinsey got money from the Rockefellers and actually hung out with Crowleans. Did you know that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And this brings back, my answer to your question, Alex, I would agree with Jay, and I would say that they were perfecting these techniques. This goes back to what E. Michael Jones talks about with Adam Weishaupt and the original Illuminati, and these techniques for social control. They're continuing to perfect, because I think my take on the death list, Dave McGowan, and I may include a recording of this at the end of the show. He lists a lot of very interesting and suspicious deaths, and I take from that this operation was a lot messier than what they would go on to perfect and sort of sterilize, because these guys were maybe a little too independent in their operations. Phil Oakes, for instance, was a very bizarre case of somebody who may have been a split personality type that was created through some kind of MK Ultra type stuff. He was a famous communist, but by the end of his life, he was talking about how he was like a CIA asset and going on about all this sort of John Birch type stuff.
Yeah.
But there were all these people who ended up dead and in very suspicious ways. And it seems to me that this sort of phase one of the Cultural Revolution was not as clean as what they've managed to perfect, especially now with like hip hop and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Well, really quickly, Alex, late in 2016, it became very publicly known, even like the BBC was writing about it, that CIA had been involved in the promulgation of abstract expressionism on the world stage and pop art.
Oh yeah, there's a Francis Stoner Saunders book, CIA and War of Letters. Yeah,
Cultural Cold War.
And Jackson Pollock's affiliations with the CIA. I mean, that was part of the Cold War dialectic, where the abstract expressionism of people like Jackson Pollock was supposed to represent the spiritual ethos of free capitalist society.
Yeah, the CIA set up a thing called the Cultural Congress for Freedom.
Yes,
and
exactly.
This was basically the idea.
It was Rockefeller funded as well.
It was completely, and the idea was to put money into all these literary guys, musicians, and even Andy Warhol. To promote the idea that we have freedom and they have cracked down tyranny.
Well, one of the primary mechanisms they utilized for not just actually promoting the artwork themselves, but the reviews of it, how to define how art is reviewed and how it's pictured, was Encounter magazine. And Encounter magazine was started and led by none other than Irving Kristol, father of Bill Kristol, and it ceased publication in 1991. It wasn't going out of business or anything. They just decided to stop publishing it.
Now
Miss Magazine. This is where you get feminism being funded by the CIA. Miss Magazine. French theorists were also employed by the CIA.
Foucault.
Yeah, exactly.
So in 2012 to 2014, it seemed like a lot of these, I don't know how we want to label them, but podcasts. I'm thinking of Joe Rogan's podcast, for example. They were pushing ayahuasca, and that's actually where I first heard about this Gordon Wasson character. Is that, I wonder what you think of that. Is that just sort of unconnected people picking up some of the breadcrumbs that these characters left behind, or is that maybe a new push to get a new type of psychedelic into the Western culture?
Well,
go ahead.
Well, there's, of course, you have Terence McKenna was a big proponent of this kind of stuff. My assessment, like if you look historically, like from the anthropological perspective about the use of these kinds of drugs, they're used in sort of the formation of like, tribal identities and solidifying the authority, the hierarchy of that tribal society. And I think that these people, what was the guy who was married to that Jew who did the sex stuff in the island?
Epstein?
No. He was a Stanford research guy. He was married. She was like
Margaret Mead.
Yeah. Her husband. He was working at Stanford Research on this kind of stuff. God, I forget his name. It's escaping me.
You come to find out that actually a lot of university CIA money was appropriated to these kinds of things over the years, like Carlos Castaneda.
Yes.
His experimentations. When Gordon Wasson and his wife went down to Latin Central South America to study and look for shrooms and drugs.
Gregory Bateson was who I was thinking.
Yeah, that's it. And Gregory Bateson's the guy who says that in order to control mankind, you have to control his imagination. So that makes me think of Disneyland, right?
Yes.
Disneyland is a whole other rabbit hole too with that kind of stuff, because it all factors into the same mind control experimentation too, which it's really crazy. I mean, it's hard to believe how deep that kind of stuff goes, but a lot of the conspiracy stuff related to that's true, I would say. But I was going somewhere with this. I forgot what.
Well, if I can give my take on Alex's question as to why this sort of stuff is happening, I think on a slightly lower level to Jay's answer to that, like they just want world government. I think the mechanisms involved that we're all talking about are basically arts and entertainment. And I don't know how stale the statistic is, but it was probably at least 10 years ago that Americans were watching 8 hours of television a day. That's an extraordinary amount of time, and that's probably more than they actually talk to their loved ones. And so if you think about capturing that mechanism of influence over the public, you're going to have a lot of power. And I think that's why the emphasis is placed on arts and entertainment.
Well, in America is this great laboratory for creating, the weird arts and entertainment is the myth engine of the society.
Yeah, right.
And America has been divorced from its European roots. And you had, for instance, I walked in my last Christmas. My dad was watching White Christmas, and I pointed out to him that this was written by a Jew, Irving Berlin. And Hollywood obviously had this big influence on the 20th century American conception of life. And they went on, the Hollywood side, but then you have Big on the Boom. I mean, they play this shit on the radio. Like, how many times have you heard Magic Carpet Ride, for instance, on the radio?
Yep.
Or Run, Run, Rudolph on the radio around Christmas time.
Yeah, the Christmas songs, or then these 60s songs. It's something that they built from, like, this is what people identify with as their past.
It was actually the Rand Corporation that studied how to move people away from having organic identities into identity being defined by consumerism, and actually the gender absurdity and insanity of the modern SJWs and trannies is actually just another evolutionary step of that, right? Because if my identity is just determined, who I am is determined by these external consumerist plastic things and toys and music or whatever, then it's also going to follow that my gender and can also just as well be something I freely choose, right? It can also become a commodity that I can purchase, right? And this is where plastic surgery also a big part of this that oftentimes gets overlooked. Because the plastic surgery stuff, I think, factored into the tranny stuff and convincing people that, you really can change your gender.
Well, and of course, race, the meaning of race and ethnicity as well, of ethnic communities. Is another.
Well, that's a part of what would be your organic identity, right? There would be layers making up who you were, prior to 1960s Cultural Revolution. Right, you're not just the guy who buys a Ford and who listens to Pink Floyd and who shops at Walmart and who now can get his dick cut off and become a woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's all very Crowleyan and whatnot. But prior to that, the 60s, you were who you were based on where you came from.
And one thing that stuck with me from McGowan's work that I related to, I'm younger than McGowan he mentioned how, people when he was growing up were listening to this much more obvious, like, corporate rock, like, Journey or Kansas or this kind of stuff. And he went back to the 60s stuff as something that seemed authentic. And I could relate to this too, because the music, I mean, despite the fact that, there's a lot of deception taking place in these early albums, like the Mr. Tambourine Man and the early Buffalo Springfield stuff, and it wasn't, there was stuff going on behind the scenes to produce it to the quality that we can listen to it now, but it did seem on its surface more authentic than the kind of stuff that was coming out in the 80s with the new wave and the big stadium corporate rock stuff, or Kiss, or that kind of crap. And this gets back to what I was saying earlier with whether this earlier experiment in synthetic culture creation was a little bit messier on the whole than what they were able to sterilize and perfect later. Would you agree with that, Jay?
Probably, but that was also not new, because if you read Bernays, he talks about how successful he was in many cases in starting trends. Mm-hmm. And that's how it ties into advertising, and that's how propaganda ties into it. So even back, I think in the 20s, things like the flapper look and mini skirts in the 20s, that was all also put out there by design.
I think it shows also just the general cultural decay, because even though these bands were garbage live, and you had to bring in Vito's Freaks to create buzz around it, objectively, when you compare 60s music, the actual studio productions with what happens now, it is objectively superior.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about the Doors versus modern day mumble rap, right? Like
exactly.
The Gen Z, they're all on pills, and you can't understand what they're saying. They're just mumbling.
They don't even have to try anymore.
Yeah.
And I get one question I do really want to pry your brain for, Jay, and because I think maybe our audience, because McGowan himself got accused of the kind of thing that is typically thrown around when you're dealing with, quote, conspiracy type stuff, is this guilt by association, where you had, these guys, they came from military families. Some of them themselves could, you could insinuate that they were participating in covert intelligence operations like Stephen Stills. But it's just a great coincidence. What do you think the mechanics were behind the scenes? I mean, this is a speculative question. I have my guesses. We can't really know. But what do you think the behind the scenes mechanics were to if these guys were, conscious
That's a great
operatives?
Question, because I don't think you have to have like members of the band literally being CIA agents. I mean, that could be, but it's not necessary, and I think that's a bit of a stretch and extreme, and most people don't know the full pictures of things. I mean, I really think that it's not until you get to the level of the PhDs and the Kissingers and the Rockefellers and the top technocrats who have the big picture. That's why I read them and try to focus on their vantage point. But when it comes to these individual people in these bands, they don't have time to. They weren't reading Carroll Quigley. They weren't reading, David Rockefeller. They had a very limited scope, I'm sure. And I'm sure some of them figured out the game was rigged and all that. But
they were reading. I mean, Morrison, for instance, was an avid reader. I mean, a lot of these guys read heavily in the occult, for instance.
Yes, that's true. Yes, what I was going to say was that you could have definitely many of them serious about the occult. I mean, Jimmy Page is, I would say, probably serious about the occult. Many of these women singers, I'm sure, are witches. I think, what's her name from Fleetwood Mac? She has long claimed to be a witch.
Stevie Nicks.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's entirely plausible. But that doesn't necessarily mean Stevie Nicks is a CIA agent. I mean,
sure.
I would say that if we wanted to look for that mechanism in the node, or that point of pressure, it would be people like their agents, the record company executives. That would be more likely who would have that level of control, and that's kind of similar to like sex rackets or prostitution. It's probably the madam that's compromised, or might be working with the FBI, or might be working for the mafia, not the whore. And this so probably not the musicians, even though there could be musicians who work for the CIA. I'm sure some do, because there have been plenty of actors who did intelligence work. So,
well, and speaking of the managers, I mean, you had people like Phil Kaufman, who was likely spooked up in some level. Herb Cohen was mobbed up. One of the guys who was the owner of the Whiskey Go-Go, Valentine was his last name. He was syndicate connected.
He was a syndicate guy, right? I forgot about that. And then, so
Warren Zevon was like the son of one of Mickey Cohen's lieutenants.
Yes.
I mean, these people, because our audience would be familiar. We have talked extensively about the syndicate broadly, the underworld and overworld connections.
I love the mob element to it. In fact, I felt that was an area that was missing in my first book. So actually, Esoteric Hollywood 2 will have a section about mafia relations to Hollywood, which
is the same thing, though, too, because when you understand your mafia history, you understand the relationship between the CIA and the mafia.
Exactly.
And so these people, like my assessment from what the kind of, I mean, Dave McGowan just puts out the raw facts, but what I tend to think is that you had these people who were sons of these families who were getting, there was some shape of a plan on high, and there was money being thrown around. Hey, you guys go live out here and we'll set you up. We're going to create a new scene. And I think a lot of the deaths come from people, because there was, when you throw in some of the weird criminal sexual behavior, I mean, for instance, Zappa sexualized all his bizarrely named children. I mean, if you guys don't know, Zappa's, I think it's worth mentioning what he named his kids. Zappa's kids were like
Moon Unit.
Well, yeah, Moon Unit being famous, Dweezil, of course, Achmet, Inuka, Diva, Thin Muffin, Pigeon. I mean, Zappa was a bizarre case, and he, as I mentioned, was sober himself. Just like by the way, his chum from school, Don Vliet, or later Don Van Vliet. Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
No, well, there's another book actually that does connect to Dave's in Mind that is worth looking at because of tangential information in regard to this question that you're talking about with handlers and mob, and that's John Potash's book, Drugs, a Weapon Against Us. And Potash comes from more of a left perspective, but it's very insightful into this very question as to who might be the person that kind of is in the background as the handler. We get this with Elvis, with the Colonel Tom character, which, pretty much everybody knows that Elvis's military handler guy was, running things. So
right, and Elvis's backup band played for Graham Parsons' solo albums. Yeah, and Elvis hung out in Laurel Canyon too, and he had similar to Morrison. Everyone knows about the did Elvis really die, and it's kind of like a meme, but. These guys, I think the best way for our audience to reflect on this is if you treat this music scene, I think I am going to go ahead and, after we record, I'm going to throw in a reading of the Death List, because if you treat this music scene, if you know anything about the Syndicate, and the history of CIA assets and mafia people, it has such a bizarre synchronicity with it in terms of the way people die, right. Mysterious boating accidents, mysterious house fires, this kind of
autoerotic asphyxiation.
Yeah,
David Carradine.
Well, David Carradine actually, funny enough, David Carradine, when the one, besides Graham Parsons, who came on later to the Byrds, and besides Hillman, Chris Hillman, who, by the way, to Jay and Alex, actually became an Orthodox Christian in the 80s. David Carradine, upon the funeral of McGinn, who's originally, I think his name was Joe. He was known as Roger McGinn, but he changed his name to Roger McGinn because of his involvement with one of these cults. I don't think we have time really to get into the process church or that stuff, which is clearly military connected, weird cult shit. But David Carradine was screaming at McGinn's coffin that you fucked my daughter, you pissed on my daughter when she was 13.
Wow.
But there's a lot of allegations of pedophilia. And I guess we should also just briefly touch on, I don't know, Jay, maybe in the future you'd be willing to come back and just do a full Manson episode because it's something people want to. You don't have to commit to that.
Sure.
Now,
I'm not a big Manson expert, but I kind of know the rough drift and,
Yeah, but you have the background knowledge to really comment on it, because a lot of the people talking about Manson don't really understand this stuff, because Manson, it should be said, he was very much a part of this Laurel Canyon scene. He wasn't some aberration, and people
Correct.
What's his name, Jay Serbling, one of the killers. Oh yeah, he was the one killed. Sorry, it was Rex Watson. They both worked at the same upscale wig salon. They worked different shifts, and they were.
Yeah, and that was a front for drug running.
Yeah, it was a drug trafficking front, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, these people.
You talking about Charles? Or is it Charles Tex Watson and Jason?
Yeah, Charles Tex Watson. Yeah. Yes.
Is there any symbolic meaning behind 27? So, who is it? Janis Joplin.
Oh yes.
Jim Morrison. Who's the other one?
Amy Winehouse.
Well, who was the first? It was the first was Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, the 27 Club. Yeah, McGowan in his book hints to a lot of this occult calendar type stuff. There's a lot of bizarre happenings on solstice and Hallows Eve and that kind of stuff. And it's a lot to unpack. But thoughts, Jay, on the 27 Club?
It's hard to prove either way, but I wouldn't be surprised. Like in Potash's book, if you read that, you get a clear picture of how deeply tied into the mafia. This stuff is, and so therefore it's easy to see how people could be wrapped up in drugs. If the handlers have their musicians addicted to drugs, that's one way they can control them. Big drug deals lead to deaths, and overdoses. So there can be that side of it to just, people overdosing because their lives are out of control and they're in with the wrong crowd. But there's also the aspect of sometimes a dead musician is worth more than a live musician, right? He becomes a legend. So there's all kinds of different. Oh yeah, exactly. There's all kinds of different angles to what could be motives, but I definitely think that the occult side of it is possible because you do have a lot of these people interested in the occult, but it's always hard to tell exactly how serious somebody takes it.
It's
hard to say.
Bizarre ritualistic killings. I mean, so you have, of course, the two most famous murders in the Laurel Canyon scene, where the Manson murders at 150 Cielo Drive with the Tate LaBianca killing, and then you have the famous Four on the Floor in Wonderland.
Yeah.
And these bizarre connections to people like John Holmes, the porn star, who himself had intelligence connections. I mean, it gets so surreal, and it's one of those cases that it's so overwhelming in how bizarre and how far-reaching the implications are that I think people are easily given to dismiss it as fanciful conspiracy type thinking.
No, I don't think. I mean, it's just that when it's a ritual type thing, that's harder to prove. I'm not saying it's not true or it doesn't happen. I think it does. I'm just saying that the empirical confirmation of that is more difficult.
There's no obvious meaning behind 27. It could be something.
I'm just speaking of the 20. Yeah, I'm just speaking of the 27 Club and the numerology. I'm not saying that there aren't ritual murders. There are. There have been many of them. Black Dahlia, etc.
Right, which also had its connections to the Laurel Canyon scene.
Exactly.
Well, if I could ask kind of a concluding sort of topic, and Nick, of course, if you have some final thoughts, I'll let you go after. But I just wanted to ask, in our modern era, where do you see potential CIA influence? Obviously, we're talking about pop culture, but are there any particular stars or record labels or movie studios or anything like that you see as sort of like focal points for the intelligence agencies?
Well, I think if you look at Operation Mockingbird, that was, most of the major media outlets already being co-opted decades ago. And I don't think that ever quit. It didn't go away. So I think that the entire system is basically more of, to use the classic conspiracy analogy, a pyramid. So it never changed.
Do you think? What do you think about the more modern tech platforms like YouTube, which we're on, by the way? But so, and I know you are too. But maybe let's talk about Twitter or Facebook. What do you think the role of the intelligence services is there?
Well, the Palantir and NQTel are the CIA seed companies that put up the money for these kinds of things. That's where Facebook comes from. That's where Google came from. I'm not exactly sure about Twitter, but I'm sure it's probably all out of the same circles. I don't really see the Silicon Valley stuff being in competition, maybe to a degree, to a level, but at the tip top, it's not. It's, in fact, what do we just have with the Jason Lanier guy who was one of the developers of Facebook? He and other top Facebook executives coming out saying they regret that Facebook was done for social engineering.
Sean Parker was one of them who was, I think, admitting that they've ruined a whole generation of kids.
Yeah.
Sean Parker, of course, was arrested for having sex with an underage girl himself, if I remember right.
Lovely.
Yeah. I mean, okay. To summarize here, it's a topic that's very difficult to untangle, and it requires. I find it especially interesting because it's the parts that have studied a lot myself with the intersection of organized crime and the intelligence services and the old WASP organizations. But essentially what you have with the 60s counterculture is it emerged out of a situation of it emerged from whole cloth, particularly in Laurel Canyon was the epicenter of this, from people who came from old WASP bloodlines, military families, very wealthy, well-connected. Themselves were not political leftists to speak of. They were much more of the Americanist establishment bent privately. And they created a whole scene using, music and drugs. And this came to be the symbol of rebellion and anti-establishment ideology for the entire boomer generation.
Right.
Do you have any concluding thoughts, Jay?
I agree. And I think if you look at the Esalen Institute and who was involved in that, you can see that while Laurel Canyon might be the artistic arm of this movement, if we want to call it that, Esalen is the spiritual, ideological arm of the same type of thing. And I would say that not everything is completely controlled and engineered, but that's how toxic culture works, is that you kind of grow something in the petri dish and you let it grow, and then you steer it. So I see it as a seeding it, letting it grow, and steering it, not like everybody's a mind control slave.
It's a golem, if you will.
There you go. Yeah, that's how Jacques Attali describes it. Yeah.
Cheers, Jay. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode with special guest Jay Dyer. I'm going to provide now an addendum to that episode where I'm going to go over Chapter 3 of the late Dave McGowan's work, Weird Scenes from in the Canyon. Now, as mentioned in the episode proper, McGowan's thesis was more or less that it was the scene in Laurel Canyon and the broader hippie counterculture revolution that blossomed out from the canyon had in its early days a preponderance of very suspicious characters who had ties to the old money establishment and the military intelligence apparatus. Now, whether or not you find it convincing or plausible that it was actually a top-down military operation in the beginning, at the very least, to quote Buffalo Springfield, there is something happening here, and what it is isn't exactly clear. Now, in addition to the most famous killings that took place in Laurel Canyon, being the Tate LaBianca murders done by the Manson family, and the 4 on the Floor murder on Wonderland Ave, prior to the period that Dave lists, you had also the deaths of Lenny Bruce, Ramon Navarro, Sal Mineo, Diane Linkletter, and Inger Stevens. And what follows now is me reading directly from Dave McGowan's work with minor commentary. So you had, firstly, Marina Elizabeth Habe, whose body was carved up and tossed into the heavy brush along Mulholland Drive, just west of Beaumont Drive, on December 30th, 1968. Habe, just 17 at the time of her death, was the daughter of Hans Habe, who immigrated to the U.S. from fascist Austria circa 1940. Shortly thereafter, Hans married a General Food heiress and began studying psychological warfare at the Military Intelligence Training Center. After completing his training, he put his psychological warfare skills to use by creating 18 newspapers in occupied Germany, under the direction, no doubt, of the OSS. Christine Hinton, who was killed in a head-on collision September 30th, 1969. At the time, Hinton was a girlfriend of David Crosby and the founder and head of the Byrds fan club. She was also the daughter of a career Army officer stationed at the notorious Presidio military base in San Francisco. Another of Crosby's girlfriend from that same time was Shelley Roker, who grew up on the Hamilton Air Force Base in Marin County. had Jane Doe, number 59, found dumped into the heavy undergrowth of Laurel Canyon in November 1969, within sight of where Habe had been dumped less than a year earlier. The teenage girl, who was never identified, had been stabbed 157 times in the chest and throat. Alan Blind Al Wilson, singer, songwriter, and guitarist for the Laurel Canyon blues rock band Canned Heat, was found in his Topanga Canyon home on September 3rd, 1970. His death was written off as a suicide OD. Wilson had moved to Topanga Canyon after the band's Laurel Canyon home on Lookout Mountain Avenue next door to Joni Mitchell and Graham Nash's home burned to the ground. Blind Al was just 27 years old at the time of his death. A little more than a decade later, Wilson's former bandmate Bob the Bear Height, who had once acknowledged in an interview that he partied in the canyons with various members of the Manson family, died of a heart attack at the ripe old age of 36. Jimi Hendrix, who reportedly briefly occupied the sprawling mansion just north of the log cabin after he moved to L.A. in 1968, died in London under seriously questionable circumstances on September 18, 1970. Though he rarely spoke of it, Jimmy had served a stint in the U.S. Army with the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell. His official records indicate that he was forced into service by the courts and then released just 1 year when he purportedly proved to be a poor soldier. One wonders why he was assigned to such an elite division if he was indeed such a failure. One also wonders why he wasn't subjected to disciplinary measures rather than being handed a free pass out of his ostensibly court-ordered service. In any event, Jimmy himself once told reporters that he was given a medical discharge after breaking an ankle during a parachute jump. One biographer has claimed Jimmy faked being gay to earn an early release. The truth, alas, remains elusive. At the time of Jimmy's death, the first person called by his girlfriend, Monica Danman, last to see Hendrix alive, was Eric Burdon of the Animals. 2 years earlier, Burdon had relocated to L.A. and taken over ringmaster duties from Frank Zappa after Zappa had vacated the log cabin and moved into a less high-profile Laurel Canyon home. Within a year of Jimmy's death, a reported prostitute-turned-groupie named Devon Wilson, who had been with Jimmy the day before his death, plunged from an 8th-floor window of New York's Chelsea Hotel. On March 5, 1973, a shadowy character named Michael Jeffrey, who had managed both Hendrix and Burdon, was killed in a mid-air plane collision. Jeffrey was known to openly boast of having organized crime connections and of working for the CIA. After Jimmy's death, it was discovered that Jeffrey had been funneling most of Hendrix's gross earnings in offshore accounts in the Bahamas linked to international drug trafficking. Years later, on April 5, 1996, Danman, the daughter of a wealthy German industrialist, was found dead near her home in a fume-filled Mercedes. Jim Morrison, who for a time lived in a home on Rothdale Trail behind the Laurel Canyon Country Store, may or may not have died in Paris on July 3rd of 1971. The events of that day remain shrouded in mystery and rumor, and the details of the story, such as they are, have changed over the years. What is known is that on that very same day, Admiral George Stephen Morrison delivered the keynote speech at a decommissioning ceremony for the aircraft carrier USS Bonhomme Richard, from where 7 years earlier he had helped choreograph the Tonkin Gulf incident. A few years after Jim's death, Pamela Corson dropped dead as well, officially of a heroin overdose. Like Hendrix, Morrison had been an avid student of the occult, with a particular fondness for the work of Aleister Crowley. According to the super groupie Pamela DeBars, he had read all that he could about incest and sadism. Also like Hendrix and Wilson, Morrison was just 27 at the time of his possible death. Brandon DeWild, a good friend of David Crosby and Graham Parsons, was killed in a freak accident in Colorado on July 6, 1972, when his van plowed under a flatbed truck. In the 1950s, DeWild had been an in-demand child actor since the age of 8. He had appeared on screen as some of the biggest names in Hollywood, including Alan Ladd, Lee Marvin, Paul Newman, John Wayne, Kirk Douglas, and Henry Fonda. Around 1965, DeWild fell in with Hollywood's Young Turks, through whom he met and befriended Crosby, Parsons, and various others of the Laurel Canyon Club. DeWild was just 30 at the time of his death. Christina Fricka, a former governess for the Moon Unit Zappa. and the Zappa family's former housekeeper at the log cabin died on November 5th, 1972 of an alleged drug overdose. Though friends suspected foul play, as Miss Christine Fricka had been a member of the Zappa-created GTOs, a musical act of sorts, composed entirely of very young groupies. She was the inspiration for the song Christine's tune Devil in Disguise by Graham Parsons' Flying Burrito Brothers. Fricka may have been in her early 20s when she died, possibly even younger. Danny Witten, a guitarist, vocalist, songwriter with Neil Young's sometime band Crazy Horse, died of an overdose on November 18, 1972. According to rock and roll legend, Witten has been fired by Young earlier that day during rehearsals in San Francisco. Young and Jack Nietzsche, Phil Spector's former top assistant, had given Witten $50 and put him on a plane back to L.A. Within hours, he was dead. Witten was just 29. Bruce Berry, a roadie for Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, died of a heroin overdose in 1973. Berry had just flown out to Maui to deliver a shipment of cocaine to Stephen Stills and was promptly sent back to L.A. by Crosby and Nash. Berry was a brother of Jan Berry of Jan and Dean. Dean Torrance, the dean of Jan and Dean, had played a part in the fake kidnapping of Frank Sinatra Jr. just a couple weeks after the JFK assassination. The staged event was a particularly transparent effort to divert attention away from the questions that were cropping up after the initial shock had passed about the events in Dealey Plaza. Clarence White, a guitarist who had played with the Byrds, was run over by a drunk driver and killed on July 14, 1973. White had grown up near Lancaster, not far from where Frank Zappa spent his teen years. At least one member of White's immediate family was employed at Edwards Air Force Base. The driver who had killed young Clarence, just 29 years old at the time of his death, was given a 1-year suspended sentence and served no time. Graham Parsons, formerly with the International Submarine Band, the Byrds, and Flying Burrito Brothers, allegedly overdosed on a speedball at the Joshua Tree Inn on September 19, 1973, just 2 months before his death. Parsons' Topanga Canyon home had burnt to the ground. After his death, his body was stolen from LAX by the Burritos road manager Phil Kaufman and taken back out to Joshua Tree and ritually burned on the autumnal equinox. Kaufman had been a prison buddy of Charlie Manson's at Terminal Island. When Phil was released from Terminal Island in March of 1968, he quickly reunited with his old pal, who had been released a year earlier. By the time of Graham's death, his family had already experienced its share of questionable deaths. Just before Christmas 1958, Parsons' father had sent Graham, along with his mother and sister, off to stay with the family in Florida. The next day, just after the winter solstice, Ingram Cecil Connor Jr. caught a bolt to the head. His death was recorded as a suicide, and it was claimed that he had sent his family away to spare them as much pain as possible. It seems just as likely, however, that Cecil knew his days were numbered and wanted to get his family out of the line of fire. The next year, 1959, Graham's mother married again to Robert Ellis Parsons, who adopted Graham and his sister, Avis. 6 years later, in June of 1965, Graham's mother died the day after a sudden illness landed her in the hospital. According to witnesses, she died almost immediately after a visit from her husband, Robert Parsons. Many of those close to the situation believe that Parsons had a hand in her death. Very shortly after, Robert Parsons married his stepdaughter's teenage babysitter. Following his mother's death, Parsons briefly attended Harvard University and then launched his music career with the formation of the International Submarine Band, which quickly found its way to where else? Laurel Canyon. Graham's death in 1973 at the age of 26 left his younger sister Avis as the sole surviving member of the family. She was killed in 1993, reportedly in a boating accident at the age of 40. Now, Mama Cass Elliott, the Earth Mother of Laurel Canyon, whose circle of friends included musicians, Mansonites, young Hollywood stars, the wealthy son of a State Department official, singer-songwriters, assorted drug dealers, and some particularly unsavory characters in the LAPD, once described as some kind of hit squad, died in the London home of Harry Nilsson on July 29, 1974. Nilsson, of course, had been a frequent drinking buddy of John Lennon in the Laurel Canyon and on the Sunset Strip. At 32, Cass had lived a long and productive life by Laurel Canyon standards. 4 years later, in the same room of that very same London flat, still owned by Harry Nilsson, Keith Moon of The Who also died at age 32 on September 7, 1978. Though initial press reports held that Cass had choked to death on a ham sandwich, the official verdict was heart failure. Her actual cause of death could likely be filed under knowing where too many bodies were buried. Moon reportedly died from a massive overdose of a drug used to treat alcohol withdrawal. Amy Gossage, Graham Nash's girlfriend, was murdered in her San Francisco home on February 13, 1975. Just 20 years old at the time, she had been stabbed nearly 50 times and was bludgeoned beyond recognition. Amy's father, a famed advertising PR executive, had died of leukemia in 1969, not long after her half-sister had been killed in a car crash. In May of 1974, her mother, the daughter of a wealthy banking family, died as well, reportedly of cirrhosis of the liver. That left just Amy, age 19, and her brother Eben, age 20, both of whom reportedly had serious drug dependencies. Amy's brutal murder, cleverly enough, was pinned on Eben. Police had conveniently found blood-stained clothes along with a hammer and scissors sitting on the porch of Eben's apartment, looking very much as though it had been planted. A friend of Eben's would later remark, perhaps quite tellingly, "If Eben did kill her, I'm convinced he doesn't know he did it." And Tim Buckley, a singer-songwriter signed to Frank Zappa's record label and managed by Herb Cohen, died of a reported overdose on June 29, 1975. Buckley had once appeared on an episode of The Monkees, and like Monkey Peter Tork and so many others in this story, he hailed from Washington, D.C. He was the son of a mentally unbalanced and occasionally violent World War II hero. Buckley was just 28 at the time of his death, which reportedly shocked many of his friends and relatives. Despite having released 9 albums during his short life, Buckley died in debt, which probably had nothing to do with his management by Cohen. His son, Jeff Buckley, also an accomplished musician, managed to remain on this planet 2 years longer than his dad did. He was 30 when he died in a bizarre drowning incident on May 29, 1997. And Phyllis Major Brown, wife of the singer-songwriter Jackson Brown, reportedly overdosed on barbiturates on March 25, 1976. Her death was, you should know the words to this song by now, ruled a suicide, and she was 30 years old. That was a portion of the 3rd chapter from Dave McGowan's work, Weird Scenes from Inside the Canyon. And as you can see, it differs markedly from the typical boomer hagiographies and Ken Burns-style nostalgia trip narratives about an organic youth revolt against an autocratic and oppressive cultural regime in the name of peace and love. Man. Well, whatever conclusions that you would like to draw from the insinuations that Dave McGowan makes in his book and in the portion that I read, keep in mind 2 things. The scene was built from the ground up by members of the establishment, the real establishment behind America at the time. What was left of the old WASP establishment, military-connected people, big-time money power. And the scene itself was populated with known spooks and syndicate-connected figures, often in the form of shady managers and club owners. And remember as well that sexual liberation and drugs are tools of social control. And on this point, I don't think our audience needs to be lectured much. It's, I think, widely accepted by our listeners that frequently promises of freedom are the path to further enslavement. Now, as for the music itself, I admit I am a fan of this music. I grew up on listening to a lot of this stuff. And looking back, and I tend to look at it a little bit like you might think of a spider's web. It's something quite beautiful in nature, but the purpose of which is, trap unsuspecting prey that will be paralyzed and have the life force sucked out of them. So keep that in mind when listening to the outro. This was a single that appeared on the album 2020 by the Beach Boys, and it is titled Never Learn Not to Love. However, there was an original title, and that was Cease to Exist, because the song was written by Charles Manson. And as we mentioned in the episode proper, the typical story goes that Manson was, by a chance meeting, encountered Dennis Wilson on his driveway, and that they became friends. And that was the limit and extent of the involvement of the Laurel Canyon scene with Charles Manson. But that is not true. Peace.